Okay, let's jump into this deep dive on the American Revolution. We're talking about that really pivotal time, roughly 1775 to 1783. Our goal here isn't just to list dates and battles, but to really get under the surface, the key moments, the figures, and maybe most interestingly, how sentiment shifted so dramatically towards independence.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because when the Second Continental Congress met in May 75, with all 13 colonies there, independence wasn't really the main goal for most. They were still focused on, getting their problems with Britain sorted out. Reconciliation, not necessarily revolution, was the dominant mood initially. Quite conservative, actually.
Right. It seems so inevitable now looking back, but back then it was more like trying to patch things up. And yet they make this huge decision pretty early on appointing George Washington to lead the new Continental Army. His selection, it feels iconic, but the reasons were quite strategic, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was very political. The northern colonies, especially Massachusetts, where a lot of the early conflict was, they desperately needed Virginia, the biggest, wealthiest colony, to be fully committed. Picking Washington, a Virginian, was a calculated move to, well, lock in that southern support. A unity move.
Makes sense. Secure Southern buy-in.
Exactly. And, while the initial reason was political, Washington's leadership, his sheer resilience later on, keeping that army together through terrible times, that proved far more important than maybe they even realized at first.
So they're building an army, but at the same time, they're still trying for peace. Seems like they're playing both sides a bit.
Well, yeah, you see that with things like the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. That was Jefferson and Dickinson. It was definitely a step up in tone compared to earlier appeals. Basically saying, look, we have to defend ourselves, but still framing it as a response to Parliament's actions, not necessarily a break from the king yet.
Okay. Stronger language, but not independence. And then the Olive Branch Petition. Sounds like a last resort.
That's exactly what it was. John Dickinson, again, really pushing for this. It was a direct appeal to King George III himself. They're professing loyalty, saying, we're still your subjects, but pleading with him to step in and fix the problems caused by Parliament, especially those intolerable acts. It was a final attempt by the moderates.
But the king, he didn't exactly jump at the chance for reconciliation, did he?
No, he wouldn't even receive the petition, refused to recognize Congress as a legitimate body, and that refusal, that dismissal, was huge. It basically told the colonists there's no peaceful way out of this. It really pushed a lot of undecided people towards the idea of a complete break.
Wow, so the door slams shut on peace talks. Meanwhile, the fighting's already started. Ticonderoga and Crown Point, May 75. Those were quick wins for the colonists, right?
Yeah, relatively small scale, but important symbolically. Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, they surprised the British garrisons there, got some much-needed cannons, which actually proved useful later in Boston, a nice little morale boost early on.
Then comes June 75, Bunker Hill, or really Breed's Hill, technically.
Yeah.
That one's famous for the British casualties, just staggering numbers.
It really is. Tactically, the Americans retreated because they ran out of gunpowder. But strategically, maybe morally, it was a huge shock to the British. They took the hill, yes, but the cost was enormous. Over 1,000 killed or wounded in those frontal assaults. It was the bloodiest battle of the whole war.
1,000 casualties.
Yeah.
That early.
Yeah. It showed the British just how determined the colonists were, even these militia forces, and it definitely played into their later decision to just leave Boston. The cost was too high.
And not long after that, the king officially declares the colonies in rebellion. August 75. That must have felt like crossing a point of no return.
It was basically a declaration of war from the British side. But the real shocker for many colonists, the hiring of mercenaries, around 18,000 Hessians, German soldiers, hired by the king to fight against his own subjects. That felt like a betrayal, using foreign troops. It really alienated a lot of people.
Wow. Yeah, I can see how that would feel personal. What about the American attempt to invade Canada around that time? Didn't go so well, did it?
No, the invasion in late 75, early 76 was a failure. They hoped to get Canada to join them, but it didn't work out. Interestingly, though, some historians argue that even though it failed, it tied up British resources and maybe delayed a big British push down from Canada, which might have inadvertently helped the Americans later on, maybe even at Saratoga. A bit of a silver lining, perhaps.
Okay, so even with the fighting and the king hiring Hessians, you said most colonists still weren't initially gunning for independence. What really tipped the balance? What pushed them over the edge?
It was a combination of things piling up. The Hessians were a big factor, like we said. Then the British started burning colonial towns Falmouth, which is Portland, Maine now, and Norfolk, Virginia. That showed a real ruthlessness.
Burning towns
Yeah.
against civilians.
Exactly. It terrified people. And then maybe the biggest thing, especially for the South, was when the royal governor of Virginia offered freedom to any enslaved person who joined the British Army. That struck right at the heart of the Southern economy and social structure. It scared the planter elite and pushed many of them firmly into the patriot camp, maybe more out of self-interest than pure ideology initially.
So anger over Hessians, fear from the burnings, and then the threat to the Southern way of life. Quite a
A
mix.
potent mix. And right into that volatile situation comes this pamphlet, Common Sense, by Thomas Paine, early 1776.
Ah, Common Sense. That was huge, wasn't it? A massive bestseller.
Absolutely transformative. It wasn't written in dense philosophical language. Paine wrote directly, forcefully for ordinary people. He just dismantled the arguments for staying with Britain and laid out a clear, powerful case for independence. Its impact was just
So
immense.
what were his main points? What made it connect so powerfully?
Well, first, he just ridiculed the whole idea of monarchy and hereditary rule, called King George the royal brute of Great Britain. Very blunt. He argued it was absurd for a tiny island to rule a vast continent like a satellite trying to control the sun, he said. He pointed out all the ways British policy had hurt the
It
colonies.
made it seem illogical to stay tied to Britain.
Exactly. And he framed independence not just as practical, but as a kind of moral duty. America's sacred mission, he called it, to create a new kind of nation, a democratic republic, free from European corruption.
Powerful stuff. Did it directly cause Congress to declare independence?
It was a massive catalyst for public opinion, which definitely put pressure on Congress. But Paine also made a really practical argument that resonated in Congress. Foreign help. He basically said, look, countries like France aren't going to help us seriously if we're just fighting to get better terms within the British Empire. They'll only back us if we're going for a full break, for total independence. They needed to see commitment.
Ah, the foreign aid angle. That makes sense. So the mood shifts, Paine's pamphlet is everywhere, and then Richard Henry Lee makes his move in Congress, June 76.
Yep, June 7th. Lee, from Virginia, introduces the resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress debated it and then officially adopted it on July 2nd. But they knew they needed more than just a resolution. They needed a formal explanation, a declaration, to justify this huge step to the world, and especially to potential allies like France.
Enter the Declaration of Independence, and the committee to write it, Jefferson was the main author, right?
Congress set up a committee of 5, Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston. Heavy hitters. But yeah, Jefferson did the bulk of the initial drafting. Adams and Franklin made some edits.
I know the draft went through changes in Congress itself.
Yeah.
What were the big sticking points?
The biggest one, by far, was slavery. Jefferson, even though he owned enslaved people himself, had put in this really strong passage blaming King George for the slave trade for forcing it on the colonies. But the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia and some others absolutely refused to accept it. Their economies depended on slavery. So after a lot of heated debate, that whole section condemning the slave trade was largely removed.
Wow. So even at the nation's birth, that fundamental contradiction is right there.
Starkly there. It's crucial to remember the compromises made just to get unity. And also, the Declaration wasn't really aimed at the king. It was for the American people to rally them and for foreign governments to make the case for recognition and support.
Okay, let's break down the final version, the 3 main parts. First, the preamble.
Right, the preamble. That's the philosophical opening. It draws heavily on Enlightenment ideas, especially John Locke. It talks about natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson's famous phrase modifying Locke's property. It says governments get their power from the consent of the governed, and people have the right to change or abolish a government that becomes destructive of those rights. And of course, that iconic line, all men are created equal.
So powerful, yet, as we just discussed, not fully realized at all.
Not even close for so many people, but it set an incredibly important ideal, a standard the nation would, grapple with for centuries. Then comes the second part, which is basically a long list of complaints against King George III. 27 specific grievances.
That was the core of it for Congress, right? The justification.
Yeah, they spent a lot of time debating and tweaking this section. It lists things like taxation without representation, restricting trade, dissolving legislatures, keeping standing armies in peacetime, interfering with the justice system, burning towns, hiring mercenaries.
Inciting Native American attacks, too, it mentions.
Yes, that's in there too. It's a comprehensive indictment of the king's actions, designed to show why separation was necessary and justified.
And the final part.
The conclusion. That's the formal declaration itself. It explicitly dissolves all political connections with Great Britain, declares the colonies free and independent states, and claims for them all the powers of independent nations, making war, peace, alliances, commerce, etc.
And the immediate result, as Payne predicted, was now they could officially go looking for allies.
Exactly. The declaration was like hanging out a sign saying, "We're open for business as an independent nation." It made soliciting foreign aid, especially from France, legitimate and much more likely to succeed.
Now, declaring independence was one thing, but American society itself wasn't united, was it? You had the Loyalists versus the Patriots.
Not at all united, it was deeply divided. You had the Loyalists, or Tories, maybe about 20% of the white population, who wanted to remain part of the British Empire. They tended to be, more conservative, often wealthier, maybe older colonists, people with strong ties to Britain like royal officials or Anglican clergy. They were strong in places like New York City, parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Charleston, but they generally didn't win over the undecided middle.
And the Patriots, the ones fighting for independence.
The Patriots, or Whigs, they were probably a minority too, maybe 40% or so, with another chunk trying to stay neutral. The Patriots were strongest in New England. They were the ones actively pushing the revolution forward. They were better organized politically, maybe more committed ideologically. And they had key figures like Robert Morris, the financier, who somehow scraped together the money to keep the war going.
What happened to the Loyalists during and after the war? Must have been tough for them.
It was incredibly difficult. They were often seen as traitors. Many faced harassment, loss of property, violence. Estimates vary, but maybe 80,000 loyalists ended up leaving, either driven out or fleeing voluntarily to Canada, Britain, or other parts of the empire. Their estates were often confiscated, which actually helped fund the war effort for the Patriots sometimes. And about 50,000 loyalists actually fought for the British.
Wow, 50,000. That's a significant number. So back to the war itself. After the early fighting around Boston, the British shifted focus to the middle colonies in 76 and 77.
Yeah, New York became their main base. They saw it as strategically key to splitting New England off from the rest. They inflicted a big defeat on Washington at the Battle of Long Island in 76. Washington's army barely escaped, first to Manhattan, then retreating across New Jersey. It was a really low point for the Americans. The British kind of missed a chance to maybe finish the Continental Army right there.
But then Washington pulls off those surprise wins at Trenton and Princeton over the winter. That must have been huge for morale.
Absolutely crucial. The army was falling apart, enlistments were ending. Washington took this incredible gamble, crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night 76, surprising the Hessians at Trenton. Then a week later, another quick victory at Princeton. These weren't huge battles strategically, maybe, but psychologically, they were immense. They saved the army, boosted morale, and showed the British the war wasn't going to be easy, forced the British to pull back a bit, too.
And then comes Saratoga, October 1777, often called the turning point of the war.
Definitely the most significant military turning point. The British had this complex plan to isolate New England, with General Burgoyne coming down from Canada, but the plan fell apart. Benedict Arnold, ironically, played a key role in slowing Burgoyne down in some fierce fighting earlier. Eventually, the Americans, under General Horatio Gates, surrounded Burgoyne's army near Saratoga and forced his entire force to surrender.
And why was that surrender so incredibly important?
Because it convinced France to finally enter the war openly on the American side. Saratoga proved the Americans could actually win major battles, that they were a viable bet. So in 1778, you get the Franco-American alliance. France brings its navy, its money, its troops. That changes everything. It turns the colonial rebellion into a global conflict for Britain. Spain and the Netherlands eventually join in against Britain, too. Saratoga made that possible.
Before we get to the French alliance, though, the winter after Saratoga was Valley Forge, right? That famous time of hardship.
Yes, the winter of 77-78, Valley Forge wasn't a battle, but it was a severe test of survival. The Continental Army faced incredible hardship, lack of food, clothing, shelter. Disease was rampant. Thousands died. Yet, they endured. Washington held them together, and importantly, that winter, Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, arrived and began rigorously training the troops, drilling them into a much more professional fighting force. Valley Forge became the symbol of American grit and determination.
And then a few years later, in 1780, you have the shock of Benedict Arnold's betrayal after being a hero earlier.
Yeah, that was a real gut punch to American morale. Arnold felt he hadn't gotten the recognition or promotions he deserved. He was bitter, facing debts. So he made a deal with the British to hand over the crucial fort at West Point on the Hudson River. The plot was discovered just in time, but Arnold escaped to the British side and fought against his former country. It was a stark reminder of the divisions and the bitterness the war could create.
While all this fighting is going on, the Americans are also trying to figure out how to govern themselves, the Articles of Confederation.
Right. Drafted back in 77, primarily by John Dickinson again, but not actually ratified by all states until 1781. This was the first government framework for the United States. It was created during the war, really to manage the war effort, conduct diplomacy, borrow money, deal with Western lands. But it deliberately created a very weak central government. The states kept most of the power.
Weak in what ways? What couldn't the Confederation Congress do?
Crucially, it couldn't levy taxes directly. It had to ask the states for money, and the states often didn't pay up. It couldn't regulate interstate commerce, which led to trade disputes between states, and it couldn't raise a national army directly. It relied on state militias or requisitions from states.
So built-in weaknesses that would cause problems later.
Big problems. State sovereignty was the priority under the Articles. It reflected a fear of strong central authority, like they'd experienced under Britain.
Okay, let's swing back to France. We know Saratoga convinced them. What were their main reasons for helping the Americans, just sticking it to Britain?
Pretty much. Revenge for the 7 Years' War, where they lost badly to Britain, was a huge motivator. Weakening their main rival, Britain, by helping deprive them of their valuable American colonies was the primary goal. It was classic European power politics.
And how did the support evolve from secret aid to that formal alliance in 78?
Initially, it was covert. France didn't want open war with Britain just yet. People like Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin in Paris worked behind the scenes, getting secret shipments of weapons and supplies. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young nobleman, famously came over on his own and became a key link, advocating for more French support.
Franklin was quite the diplomat in Paris, wasn't he?
Hugely effective. He charmed French society. But really, it was Saratoga, the military victory, combined with the declaration showing American resolve that sealed the deal for the formal alliance.
So the Franco-American alliance of 1778, what did it entail?
It was a formal treaty. France recognized American independence. Crucially, both sides agreed to fight until American independence was formally or tacitly assured, and neither side would make a separate peace with Britain without the other's consent.
Was everyone in America thrilled about allying with their old enemy, Catholic France?
There was some hesitation, yeah. Generations of fighting against France, plus religious differences. Some Americans were wary, but they desperately needed the help, so pragmatism won out.
And this alliance brings in other European powers, too.
Yes. Spain joined the fight against Britain in 1779, hoping to regain lost territories like Florida and Gibraltar. The Netherlands joined later, largely due to trade disputes with Britain. And then you had Catherine the Great of Russia organizing the League of Armed Neutrality, basically telling Britain to stop interfering with neutral shipping. So the American Revolution became a genuine world war, stretching British resources incredibly thin across the globe.
We tend to focus on the East Coast battles, but there was fighting elsewhere too, right? On the frontier, at sea.
Absolutely. The western frontier saw incredibly brutal fighting. Many Native American tribes allied with the British who promised to protect their lands from encroaching settlers. Figures like Joseph Brant led devastating raids. 1777 was called the Bloody Year on the frontier. Treaties like Fort Stanwix later forced huge land cessions from Native Americans. And despite the war, settlers kept pushing west. George Rogers Clark led campaigns in the Illinois country, capturing British forts. There's debate about how much that influenced the final peace terms, but it was significant fighting.
What about the naval war? John Paul Jones is famous.
Yeah, John Paul Jones had some daring victories, raiding British shipping, famously saying, "I have not yet begun to fight." Good for morale. But the Continental Navy itself was tiny compared to the Royal Navy. It couldn't really challenge British control of the seas.
So how did the Americans fight at sea effectively?
Privateers. These were privately owned, armed ships, essentially licensed pirates authorized by Congress to attack British merchant ships. There were hundreds of them. They captured thousands of British ships, disrupted trade badly, made fortunes for some, and really annoyed the British, forcing them to use warships for convoy duty. They were probably more effective in a way than the actual Continental Navy. Plus, the big naval battles were mostly between the French, Spanish, and British fleets, often down in the Caribbean.
Okay, so the war drags on, becomes global. The British changed strategy, again shifting focus to the south around 1778.
Yes, they thought there were more loyalists in the South they could rally. They hoped to secure the southern colonies and then move north. They had early success capturing Savannah, then Charleston in 1780, which was a huge disaster for the Americans, captured a large chunk of their Southern army. Looked bad for a while.
But it didn't end the war there.
No. General Nathaniel Greene took command for the Americans in the South. He fought a brilliant campaign of attrition, fighting, retreating, wearing down the British under Cornwallis. He couldn't always win battles, but he won the campaign, clearing the British out of most of Georgia and the Carolinas. This eventually led Cornwallis to pull his exhausted army back to Yorktown, Virginia, seeking resupply by sea.
Which sets up the final act, Yorktown, 1781.
Exactly. Perfect timing and coordination. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed up and blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis's escape route or any chance of British rescue by sea.
Trapped him.
Completely trapped. Then Washington, coordinating with the French army under Rochambeau, marched their combined forces south rapidly, laid siege to Yorktown, and bombarded the British relentlessly. Cornwallis had no choice. He surrendered his entire army on October 19, 1781. That was basically the end of major fighting in North America, though the war officially dragged on elsewhere for a bit longer.
Even after Yorktown, though, there was still some internal trouble. The Newburgh Conspiracy.
Yes, early 1783, a really dangerous moment. Officers in the Continental Army were angry because they hadn't been paid in ages. Congress, under the weak articles, couldn't force the states to provide the money. There was serious talk among some officers about marching on Congress, maybe even using the army to set up a stronger government, possibly a military dictatorship, just to get paid.
That sounds terrifying. How was it stopped?
George Washington. He intervened personally, gave a very emotional speech to his officers at Newburgh, appealing to their honor and patriotism, reminding them what they'd fought for: civilian government, not military rule. He famously put on his glasses, saying he'd grown gray and nearly blind in service to his country. It diffused the situation, but it showed just how fragile things were.
So, the fighting's over, the internal crisis averted. Time for peace talks. Sounds like the negotiations themselves were pretty tricky.
Very tricky. Britain was ready for peace after Yorktown and losses elsewhere. Lord North's government fell. But America's ally, France, had its own agenda. They probably wanted a weaker U.S., maybe still somewhat dependent on them.
And Spain had interests too, especially in the West.
Right. The American negotiators, Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, were supposed to consult with France constantly, as per Congress's instructions, but they grew suspicious that France and Spain might try to limit American expansion west of the Appalachians.
So what did they do?
They basically ignored their instructions from Congress and started separate, secret negotiations directly with the British. A bold move.
Did it work? What did they get in the Treaty of Paris in 1783?
It worked brilliantly for the Americans. Britain formally recognized U.S. independence, and they got incredibly generous boundaries, all the land east of the Mississippi River, north to Canada, south to Florida, way more than France or Spain probably wanted them to have.
What else was in the treaty?
Fishing rights off Newfoundland for Americans. A British promise not to take away slaves, though that wasn't really honored. On the American side, they promised to recommend that states restore Loyalist property and urge that debts owed to British merchants be paid. Those promises weren't well kept either, causing future problems.
And France?
France had to approve the treaty eventually, but really America was the big winner. Britain lost its colonies. France got revenge but ended up bankrupt, which contributed to their own revolution later.
The war itself must have profoundly changed American society.
Oh, massively. Hundreds of thousands served with high casualties. Cities were occupied. Everyone was affected by the war economy. And it wasn't just elite white men. Poor farmers and laborers made up much of the army. African Americans, both enslaved and free, fought on both sides, often hoping for freedom. Native Americans were deeply involved, mostly siding with the British. Women took on huge new responsibilities, managing farms and businesses, supporting the army, becoming more politically aware. The Republican motherhood idea emerges later.
So what were the big societal shifts after the war?
Well, the departure of so many loyalists actually made state governments more democratic in some ways. The revolution sparked a real debate about slavery. Anti-slavery societies formed. Most northern states began processes of gradual abolition, helped by court cases like Quock Walker in Massachusetts. Slavery was banned in the Northwest Territory. But, and this is a huge but, slavery remained entrenched in the South. Discrimination against free blacks continued everywhere, and the invention of the cotton gin later would tragically revitalize Southern slavery.
What about equality? That all men are created equal?
Right. There was definitely a stronger emphasis on equality, but with big limits. Property requirements for voting started to lower, but were still common. Women, children, enslaved people, Native Americans, they certainly weren't seen as equal. Old aristocratic practices like primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits everything, were abolished.
And religion.
Big changes there, too. A move towards separation of church and state. Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was a landmark. The Anglican Church, associated with Britain, was disestablished. Congregational churches in New England lost their official status more slowly.
State governments changed too.
Yes, states wrote new constitutions, usually with three branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial, embodying Republican ideals. But state sovereignty remained strong. Native Americans were left incredibly vulnerable without British protection against westward expansion. And women, despite Republican motherhood, they didn't gain significant legal or political rights.
The historian Gordon Wood argues the revolution was incredibly radical socially. What's his main point?
Wood's argument in the radicalism of the American Revolution is that it wasn't just about independence. It fundamentally transformed American society and culture. He says it made the pursuit of happiness, the well-being of ordinary people, a central goal of government. It broke down old aristocratic hierarchies, fostered egalitarian thinking, brought new respect to ordinary work, created a more popular style of politics, and unleashed entrepreneurial energy even before industrialization really took off. He sees it as deeply transformative at a social level.
So, quite a journey. From colonists wanting their rights respected within the empire to fighting a global war for independence and fundamentally reshaping their own society.
It really is remarkable. The key things that stand out are, the power of political organization, how potent ideas can be in shifting minds, the absolute necessity sometimes of foreign help, and just how deeply a revolution can change a society, even while, yes, leaving major contradictions and inequalities unresolved.
It makes you think. Considering how reluctant they were at first, what single thing, an event, an idea do you think was the most decisive factor in pushing them irretrievably towards independence? And maybe, how does understanding that tipping point let us think about how major societal shifts happen today? Definitely something to chew on.